them jocosely obscene, easy to understand, and on the whole rather jolly and sympathetic. It must have required a ladder to reach certain spots, but I suppose it was worthwhile doing it, even looking at it from just the psychological viewpoint. Sometimes, as I stood there taking a leak, I wondered what an impression it would make on those swell dames whom I observed passing in and out of the beautiful lavatories on the Champs-Élysées. I wondered if they would carry their tails so high if they could see what was thought of an ass here. In their world, no doubt, everything was gauze and velvet, or they made you think so with the fine scents they gave out, swishing past you. Some of them hadn't always been such fine ladies either, some of them swished up and down like that just to advertise their trade. And maybe, when they were left alone with themselves, when they talked out loud in the privacy of their boudoirs, maybe some strange things fell out of their mouths too, because in that world, just as in every world, the greater part of what happens is just muck and filth, sorted as any garbage can, only they are lucky enough to be able to put covers over the can. As I say, that afternoon life with Tanya never had any bad effect upon me. Once in a while I'd get too much of a skinful and I'd have to stick my finger down my throat because it's hard to read proof when you're not all there. It requires more concentration to detect a missing comma than to epitomize Nietzsche's philosophy. You can be brilliant sometimes, when you're drunk, but brilliance is out of place in the proofreading department. Dates, fractions, semicolons, these are the things that count. And these are the things that are most difficult to track down when your mind is all ablaze. Now and then I made some bad blunders, and if it weren't that I had learned how to kiss the boss's ass, I would have been fired, that's certain. I even got a letter one day from the big mogul upstairs, a guy I never even met, so high up he was, and between a few sarcastic phrases about my more than ordinary intelligence, he hinted pretty plainly that I'd better learn my place and toe the mark or there'd be what's what to pay. Frankly, that scared the shit out of me. After that I never used a polysyllabic word in conversation, in fact, I hardly ever opened my trap all night. I played the high-grade moron, which is what they wanted of us. Now and then, to sort of flatter the boss, I'd go up to him and ask him politely what such and such a word might mean. He liked that. He was a sort of dictionary and time table, that guy. No matter how much beer he guzzled during the break. And he made his own private breaks too, seeing as how he was running the show you could never trip him up on a date or a definition. He was born to the job. My only regret was that I knew too much. It leaked out now and then, despite all the precautions I took. If I happened to come to work with a book under my arm, this boss of ours would notice it, and if it were a good book it made him venomous. But I never did anything intentionally to displease him. I liked the job too well to put a noose around my neck. Just the same, it's hard to talk to a man when you have nothing in common with him. You betray yourself, even if you use only monosyllabic words. He knew goddamn well, the boss, that I didn't take the least bit of interest in his yams, and yet, explain it how you will, it gave him pleasure to wean me away from my dreams and fill me full of dates and historical events. It was his way of taking revenge, I suppose. The result was that I developed a bit of a neurosis. As soon as I hit the air I became extravagant. It wouldn't matter what the subject of conversation happened to be, as we started back to Montparnasse in the early morning. I'd soon turn the fire hose on it, squelch it, in order to trot out my perverted dreams. I liked best talking about those things which none of us knew anything about. I had cultivated a mild sort of insanity, echalalia, 162 I think. It's called. All the tag ends of a night's proofing danced on the tip of my tongue. Dalmatia I had held copy of an ad for that beautiful jeweled resort. All right, Dalmatia. You take a train and in the morning your pores are perspiring and the grapes are bursting their skins. I could reel it off. About Dalmatia from the Grand Boulevard to Cardinal Mazarine's palace. Further, if I chose to. I don't even know where it is on the map, and I don't want to know ever, but at 3 in the morning with all that lead in your veins and your clothes saturated with sweat and patchouli and the clink of bracelets passing through the ringer and those beer yams that I was braced for, little things like geography, costume, speech, architecture don't mean a goddamn thing. Dalmatia belongs to a certain hour of the night, when those high-goings are snuffed out and the court of the Louvre seems so wonderfully ridiculous that you feel like weeping for no reason at all, just because it's so beautifully silent, so empty, so totally unlike the front page. And the guys upstairs rolling the dice with that little piece of Dalmatia resting on my throbbing nerves like a cold knife blade I could experience the most wonderful sensations of voyage. And the funny thing is again that I could travel all around the globe but America would never enter my mind. It was even further lost than a lost continent, because with the lost continents I felt some mysterious attachment, whereas with America I felt nothing at all. Now and then, it's true, I did think of Mona, not as of a person in a definite aura of time and space, but separately, detached. As though she had blown up into a great cloud-like form that blotted out the past. I couldn't allow myself to think about her very long. If I had I would have jumped off the bridge. It's strange. I had become so reconciled to this life without her, and yet if I thought about her only for a minute it was enough to pierce the bone and marrow of my contentment and shove me back again into the agonizing gutter of my wretched past. For 7 years I went about, day and night, with only one thing on my mind. Her. Were there a Christian so faithful to his God as I was to her we would all be Jesus Christ's today. Day and night I thought of her, even when I was deceiving her. And now sometimes, in the very midst of things, sometimes, when I feel that I am absolutely free of it all, suddenly, in rounding a corner, perhaps, there will bob up a little square, a few trees and a bench, a deserted spot where we stood and had it out, where we drove each other crazy with bitter, jealous scenes. Always some deserted spot, like the place de l'Estrapade, for example, or those dingy, mournful streets off the mosque or along that open tomb of an avenue de Breteuil which at 10 o'clock in the evening is so silent, so dead, that it makes one think of murder or suicide, anything that might create a vestige of human drama. When I realize that she is gone, perhaps gone forever, a great void opens up and I feel that I am falling into deep, black space. And this is worse than tears, deeper than regret or pain or sorrow, it is the abyss into which Satan was plunged. There is no climbing back, no ray of light, no sound of human voice or human touch of hand. How many thousand times, in walking through the streets at night, have I wondered if the day would ever come again when she would be at my side. All those yearning looks I bestowed on the buildings and statues, I had looked at them so hungrily, so desperately, that by now my thoughts must have become a part of the very buildings and statues, they must be saturated with my anguish. I could not help but reflect also that when we had walked side by side through these mournful, dingy streets now so saturated with my dream and longing, she had observed nothing, felt nothing, they were like any other streets to her, a little more sordid. Perhaps, and that is all. She wouldn't remember that at a certain corner I had stopped to pick up her hairpin, or that, when I bent down to tie her laces, I remarked the spot on which her foot had rested and that it would remain there forever, even after the cathedrals had been demolished and the whole Latin civilization wiped out forever and ever. Walking down the Rue Lomond one night in a fit of unusual anguish and desolation, certain things were revealed to me with poignant clarity. Whether it was that I had so often walked this street in bitterness and despair, or whether it was the remembrance of a phrase which she had dropped one night as we stood at the Place Lucienne Hair, I do not know. "Why don't you show me that Paris," she said, "that you have written about?" One thing I know, that at the recollection of these words I suddenly realized the impossibility of ever revealing to her that Paris which I had gotten to know, the Paris whose arrondissements are undefined, a Paris that has never existed except by virtue of my loneliness, my hunger for her. Such a huge Paris! It would take a lifetime to explore it again. This Paris, too, which I alone had the key, hardly lends itself to a tour, even with the best of intentions. It is a Paris that has to be lived, that has to be experienced. Each day in 1,000 different forms of torture, a Paris that grows inside you like a cancer, and grows until you are eaten away by it. Stumbling down the Rue Mouffetard, with these reflections stirring in my brain, I recalled another strange item out of the past, out of that guidebook whose leaves she had asked me to turn, but which, because the covers were so heavy, I then found impossible to pry open. For no reason at all, because at the moment my thoughts were occupied with Salavan, in whose sacred precincts I was now meandering. For no reason at all, I say, there came to mind the recollection of a day when, inspired by the plaque, impulsively entered the pension Orfila and asked to see the room Strindberg had occupied. Up to that time nothing very terrible had befallen me, though I had already lost all my worldly possessions and had known what it was to walk the streets in hunger and in fear of the police. Up to then I had not found a single friend in Paris, a circumstance which was not so much depressing as bewildering, for wherever I have roamed in this world the easiest thing for me to discover has been a friend. But in reality, nothing very terrible had happened to me yet. One can live without friends, as one can live without love, or even without money, that supposed sine qua non. 163 One can live in Paris. I discovered that on just grief and anguish, a bitter nourishment, perhaps the best there is for certain people. At any rate, I had not yet come to the end of my rope. I was only flirting with disaster. I had time and sentiment enough to spare to peep into other people's lives, to dally with the dead stuff of romance which, however morbid it may be, when it is wrapped between the covers of a book, seems deliciously remote and anonymous. As I was leaving the place I was conscious of an ironic smile hovering over my lips, as though I were saying to myself, not yet, the pension or phyla. Since then, of course, I have learned what every madman in Paris discovers sooner or later, that there are no ready-made infernos for the tormented. It seems to me I understand a little better now why she took such huge delight in reading Strindberg. I can see her looking up from her book after reading a delicious passage and, with tears of laughter in her eyes, saying to me, "You're just as mad as he was. You want to be punished." What a delight that must be to the sadist when she discovers her own proper masochist. When she bites herself, as it were, to test the sharpness of her teeth. In those days, when I first knew her, she was saturated with Strindberg. That wild carnival of maggots, which he revelled in, that eternal duel of the sexes, that spiderish ferocity, which had endeared him to the sodden oafs of the Northland, it was that which had brought us together. We came together in a dance of death, and so quickly was I sucked down into the vortex that when I came to the surface again I could not recognize the world. When I found myself loose, the music had ceased, the carnival was over, and I had been picked clean. After leaving the pension or phyla that afternoon I went to the library, and there, after bathing in the Ganges and pondering over the signs of the zodiac, I began to reflect on the meaning of that inferno which Strindberg had so mercilessly depicted. And, as I ruminated, it began to grow clear to me, the mystery of his pilgrimage, the flight which the poet makes over the face of the earth, and then, as if he had been ordained to reenact a lost drama, the heroic descent to the very bowels of the earth, the dark and fearsome sojourn in the belly of the whale, the bloody struggle to liberate himself, to emerge clean of the past, a bright, gory sun god cast up on an alien shore. It was no mystery to me any longer why he and others, Dante, Rabelais, Van Gogh, etc., etc., had made their pilgrimage to Paris. I understood then why it is that Paris attracts the tortured, the hallucinated, the great maniacs of love. I understood why it is that here, at the very hub of the wheel, one can embrace the most fantastic, the most impossible theories, without finding them in the least strange. It is here that one reads again the books of his youth, and the enigmas take on new meanings. 1. For every white hair, one walks the streets knowing that he is mad, possessed, because it is only too obvious that these cold, indifferent faces are the visages of one's keepers. Here all boundaries fade away, and the world reveals itself for the mad slaughterhouse that it is. The treadmill stretches away to infinitude, the hatches are closed down tight, logic runs rampant, with bloody cleavers flashing. The air is chill and stagnant, the language apocalyptic. Not an exit sign anywhere, no issue save death. A blind alley at the end of which is a scaffold. An eternal city, Paris. More eternal than Rome, more splendorous than Nineveh. The very navel of the world to which, like a blind and faltering idiot, one crawls back on hands and knees, and, like a cork that has drifted finally to the dead center of the ocean, one floats here in the scum and rack of the seas, listless, hopeless, heedless even of a passing Columbus. The cradles of civilization are the putrid sinks of the world, the charnel house to which the stinking wombs confide their bloody packages of flesh and bone. The streets were my refuge. And no man can understand the glamour of the streets until he is obliged to take refuge in them, until he has become a straw that is tossed here and there by every zephyr 167 that blows. One passes along a street on a wintry day and, seeing a dog for sale, one is moved to tears. While across the way, cheerful as a cemetery, stands a miserable hut that calls itself Hotel du Tombeau des Lapins 168. That makes one laugh fit to die. Until one notices that there are hotels everywhere, for rabbits, dogs, lice, emperors, cabinet ministers, pawnbrokers, horse knackers, and so on. And almost every other. One is in Hotel de l'Avenir 169. Which makes one more hysterical still. So many hotels of the future. No hotels in the past participle, no subjunctive modes, no conjunctivitis. Everything is hoary, grisly, bristling with merriment, swollen with the future, like a gum boil. Drunk with this lecherous eczema of the future, I stagger over to the place. Violet, the colors all mauve and slate, the doorways so low that only dwarfs and goblins could hobble in. Over the dull cranium of Zola the chimneys are belching pure coke, while the Madonna of sandwiches listens with cabbage ears to the bubbling of the gas tanks, those beautiful bloated toads which squat by the roadside. Why do I suddenly recollect the Passage des Thermopyples? Because that day a woman addressed her puppy in the apocalyptic language of the slaughterhouse, and the little bitch, she understood what this greasy slut of a midwife was saying. How that depressed me! More even than the sight of those whimpering curs that were being sold on the Rue Branzillon. Because it was not the dogs which filled me so with pity, but the huge iron railing, those rusty spikes which seemed to stand between me and my rightful life. In the pleasant little lane near the Abattoir de Vaugirard, Abattoir Hypophagic, which is called the Rue des Perroquets, I had noticed here and there signs of blood. Just as Strindberg in his madness had recognized omens and portents in the very flagging of the pension or phyla. So, as I wandered aimlessly through this muddy lane bespattered with blood, fragments of the past detached themselves and floated listlessly before my eyes, taunting me with the direst forebodings. I saw my own blood being spilled, the muddy road stained with it, as far back as I could remember, from the very beginning doubtless. One is ejected into the world. Like a dirty little mummy, the roads are slippery with blood and no one knows why it should be so. Each one is travelling his own way and, though the earth be rotting with good things, there is no time to pluck the fruits. The procession scrambles toward the exit sign, and such a panic is there. Such a sweat to escape, that the weak and the helpless are trampled into the mud and their cries are unheard. My world of human beings had perished, I was utterly alone in the world. And for friends I had the streets, and the streets spoke to me in that sad, bitter language compounded of human misery, yearning, regret, failure, wasted effort. Passing under the viaduct along the Rue Broca, one night, after I had been informed that Mona was ill and starving, I suddenly recalled that it was here in the squalor and gloom of this sunken street, terrorized perhaps by a premonition of the future, that Mona clung to me and with a quivering voice begged me to promise that I would never leave her, never. No matter what happened. And, only a few days later, I stood on the platform of the Gare Saint Lazare, and I watched the train pull out, the train that was bearing her away. She was leaning out of the window, just as she had leaned out of the window when I left her in New York, and there was that same, sad, incrustable smile on her face, the last-minute look which is intended to convey so much, but which is only a mask that is twisted by a vacant smile. Only a few days before, she had clung to me desperately, and then something happened, something which is not even clear to me now. And of her own volition she boarded the train, and she was looking at me again with that sad, enigmatic smile which baffles me, which is unjust, unnatural, which I distrust with all my soul. And now it is I, standing in the shadow of the viaduct, who reach out for her, who cling to her desperately. And there is that same inexplicable smile on my lips, the mask that I have clamped down over my grief. I can stand here and smile vacantly, and no matter how fervid my prayers, no matter how desperate my longing, there is an ocean between us, there she will stay and starve, and here I shall walk from one street to the next, the hot tears scalding my face. It is that sort of cruelty which is embedded in the streets, it is that which stares out from the walls and terrifies us when suddenly we respond to a nameless fear, when suddenly our souls are invaded by a sickening panic. It is that which gives the lampposts their ghoulish twists, which makes them beckon to us and lure us to their strangling grip, it is that which makes certain houses appear like the guardians of secret crimes and their blind windows like the empty sockets of eyes that have seen too much. It is that sort of thing, written into the human physiognomy of the streets, which makes me flee when overhead I suddenly see inscribed Impasse Satan. That which makes me shudder when at the very entrance to the mosque I observe that it is written, Mondays and Thursdays tuberculosis, Wednesdays and Fridays syphilis. In every metro station there are grinning skulls that greet you with Defendez-vous. Center la syphilis. Wherever there are walls, there are posters with bright venomous crabs heralding the approach of cancer. No matter where you go, no matter what you touch, there is cancer and syphilis. It is written in the sky, it flames and dances, like an evil portent. It has eaten into our souls, and we are nothing but a dead thing like the moon. I think it was the 4th of July when they took the chair from under my ass. Again. Not a word of warning. One of the big mucky mucks from the other side of the water had decided to make economies, cutting down on proofreaders, and helpless little dactylos enabled him to pay the expenses of his trips back and forth in the palatial quarters he occupied at the Ritz. After paying what little debts I had accumulated among the linotype operators and a goodwill token at the bistro across the way, in order to preserve my credit, there was scarcely anything left out of my final pay. I had to notify the patron of the hotel that I would be leaving. I didn't tell him. Why? Because he'd have been worried about his measly 200 francs. What'll you do if you lose your job? That was the phrase that rung in my ears continually. Cayest main tenant. Ausgespielt. Nothing to do but get down into the street again, walk, hang around, sit on benches, kill time. By now, of course, my face was familiar in Montparnasse. For a while I could pretend that I was still working on the paper. That would make it a little easier to bum a breakfast or a dinner. It was summertime and the tourists were pouring in. I had schemes up my sleeve for mulcting them. What'll you do? Well, I wouldn't starve, that's one thing. If I should do nothing else but concentrate on food that would prevent me from falling to pieces. For a week or two I could still go to Monsieur Paul's and have a square meal. Every evening, he wouldn't know whether I was working or not. The main thing is to eat. Trust to Providence for the rest. Naturally, I kept my ears open for anything that sounded like a little dough. And I cultivated a whole new set of acquaintances, bores whom I had sedulously avoided heretofore, drunks whom I loathed, artists who had a little money, Guggenheim prize men, etc. It's not hard to make friends when you squat on a terrace 12 hours a day. You get to know every sot in Montparnasse. They cling to you like lice, even if you have nothing to offer them but your ears. Now that I had lost my job, Carl and Van Norden had a new phrase for me: what if your wife should arrive now? Well, what of it? 2 mouths to feed, instead of 1. I'd have a companion in misery. And, if she hadn't lost her good looks, I'd probably do better in double harness than alone. The world never permits a good-looking woman to starve. Tanya I couldn't depend on to do much for me. She was sending money to Sylvester. I had thought at first that she might let me share her room, but she was afraid of compromising herself. Besides, she had to be nice to her boss. The first people to turn to when you're down and out are the Jews. I had 3 of them on my hands almost at once. Sympathetic souls. One of them was a retired fur merchant who had an itch to see his name in the papers. He proposed that I write a series of articles under his name for a Jewish daily in New York. I had to scout around the Dome and the Coupole searching for prominent Jews. The first man I picked on was a celebrated mathematician. He couldn't speak a word of English. I had to write about the theory of shock from the diagrams he left on the paper napkins. I had to describe the movements of the astral bodies and demolish the Einsteinian conception at the same time. All for 25 francs. When I saw my articles in the newspaper I couldn't read them, but they looked impressive, just the same, especially with the pseudonym of the fur merchant attached. I did a lot of pseudonymous writing during this period. When the big new whorehouse opened up on the boulevard Edgar Quinet, I got a little rake-off for writing the pamphlets. That is to say, a bottle of champagne and a free fuck in one of the Egyptian rooms. If I succeeded in bringing a client I was to get my commission, just like KP got his in the old days. One night I brought Van Norden. He was going to let me earn a little money by enjoying himself upstairs. Le Sphinx. But when the madam learned that he was a newspaper man, she wouldn't hear of taking money from him. It was a bottle of champagne again. And a free fuck. I got nothing out of it. As a matter of fact, I had to write the story for him, because he couldn't think how to get round the subject without mentioning the kind of place it was. One thing after another like that. I was getting fucked good and proper. The worst job of all was a thesis I undertook to write for a deaf and dumb psychologist. A treatise on the care of crippled children. My head was full of diseases and braces and work benches and fresh air theories. It took about 6 weeks off and on, and then to rub it in, I had to proofread the goddamned thing. It was in French, such A French as I've never in my life seen or heard. But it brought me in a good breakfast every day, an American breakfast, with orange juice, oatmeal, cream, coffee, now and then, ham and eggs for a change. It was the only period of my Paris days that I ever indulged in a decent breakfast, thanks to the crippled children of Rockaway Beach, the East Side, and all the coves and inlets bordering on these sore points. Then one day I fell in with a photographer. He was making a collection of the slimy joints of Paris for some degenerate in Munich. He wanted to know if I would pose for him with my pants down, and in other ways. I thought of those skinny little runts, who look like bellhops and messenger boys, that one sees on pornographic postcards in little bookshop windows occasionally, they mysterious phantoms who inhabit the Rue de la Lune and other malodorous quarters of the city. I didn't like very much the idea of advertising my Fisog in the company of these elite. But, since I was assured that the photographs were for a strictly private collection, and since it was destined for Munich, I gave my consent. When you're not in your hometown you can permit yourself little liberties, particularly for such a worthy motive as earning your daily bread. After all, I hadn't been so squeamish, come to think of it, even in New York. There were nights when I was so damned desperate, back there, that I had to go out right in my own neighborhood and panhandle. We didn't go to the show places familiar to the tourists, but to the little joints where the atmosphere was more congenial, where we could play a game of cards in the afternoon before getting down to work. He was a good companion, the photographer. He knew the city inside out, the walls. Particularly, he talked to me about Goethe often, and the days of the Hohenstaufen, and the massacre of the Jews during the reign of the Black Death. Interesting subjects, and always related in some obscure way to the things he was doing. He had ideas for scenarios too, astounding ideas, but nobody had the courage to execute them. The sight of a horse split open, like a saloon door, would inspire him to talk of Dante or Leonardo da Vinci, or Rembrandt, from the slaughterhouse at Villette. He would jump into a cab and rush me to the Trocadero Museum, in order to point out a skull or a mummy that had fascinated him. We explored the 5th, the 13th, the 19th, and the 20th arrondissements thoroughly. Our favorite resting places were lugubrious little spots such as the Place Nationale, Place des Peupliers, Place Contrescarpe, Place Paul Verlaine. Many of these places were already familiar to me, but all of them I now saw in a different light owing to the rare flavor of his conversation. If today I should happen to stroll down the Rue du Château des Renders, for example, inhaling the fetid stench of the hospital beds with which the 13th arrondissement reeks, my nostrils would undoubtedly expand with pleasure. Because, compounded with that odor of stale piss and formaldehyde, there would be the odors of our imaginative voyages through the charnel house of Europe which the Black Death had created. Through him I got to know a spiritual-minded individual named Kruger, who was a sculptor and painter. Kruger took a shine to me for some reason or other. It was impossible to get away from him once he discovered that I was willing to listen to his esoteric 173 ideas. There are people in this world for whom the word esoteric seems to act as a divine ichor. 174 like settled For Herr Peppercorn of the Magic Mountain. Kruger was one of those saints who have gone wrong, a masochist, an anal type whose law is scrupulousness, rectitude, and conscientiousness, who on an off day would knock a man's teeth down his throat without a qualm. He seemed to think I was ripe to move on to another plane, a higher plane, as he put it. I was ready to move on to any plane he designated, provided that one didn't eat less or drink less. He chewed my head off about the thread soul, the causal body, ablation, the Upanishads, Plodness, Krishnamurti, the karmic vestiture 175 of the soul, the nirvanic consciousness, all that flapdoodle which blows out of the east like a breath from the plague. Sometimes he would go into a trance and talk about his previous incarnations, how he imagined them to be, at least. Or he would relate his dreams which, so far as I could see, were thoroughly insipid, 176 prosaic. Hardly worth even the attention of a Freudian, but, for him, there were vast esoteric marvels hidden in their depths which I had to aid him to decipher. He had turned himself inside out, like a coat whose nap is worn off. Little by little, as I gained his confidence, I wormed my way into his heart. I had him at such a point that he would come running after me, in the street, to inquire if he could lend me a few francs. He wanted to hold me together in order to survive the transition to a higher plane. I acted like a pear that is ripening on the tree. Now and then I had relapses and I would confess my need for more earthly nourishment, a visit to the Sphinx or the Rue St. Apollon, where I knew he repaired in weak moments when the demands of the flesh had become too vehement. As a painter he was nil, as a sculptor less than nil. He was a good housekeeper, that I'll say for him. And an economical one to boot. Nothing went to waste, not even the paper that meat was wrapped in. Friday nights, he threw open his studio to his fellow artists. There was always plenty to drink and good sandwiches, and if by chance there was anything left over I would come round the next day to polish it off. Back of the Bal Bullier was another studio I got into the habit of frequenting. The studio of Mark Swift. If he was not a genius he was certainly an eccentric, this caustic Irishman. He had for a model a Jewess whom he had been living with for years. He was now tired of her and was searching for a pretext to get rid of her. But as he had eaten up the dowry which she had originally brought with her, he was puzzled as to how to disembarrass himself of her without making restitution. The simplest thing was to so antagonize her that she would choose starvation rather than support his cruelties. She was rather a fine person, his mistress. The worst that one could say against her was that she had lost her shape, and her ability to support him any longer. She was a painter herself and, among those who professed to know, it was said that she had far more talent than he. But no matter how miserable he made life for her, she would never allow anyone to say that he was not a great painter. It was because he really has genius, she said, that he was such a rotten individual. One never saw her canvases on the wall, only his. Her things were stuck away in the kitchen. Once it happened, in my presence, that someone insisted on seeing her work. The result was painful. You see this figure, said Swift, pointing to one of her canvases with his big foot. The man standing in the doorway there is just about to go out for a leak. He won't be able to find his way back because His head is on wrong. Now take that nude over there. It was all right until she started to paint the cunt. I don't know what she was thinking about, but she made it so big that her brush slipped and she couldn't get it out again. By way of showing us what a nude ought to be like, he hauls out a huge canvas which he had recently completed. It was a picture of her, a splendid piece of vengeance inspired by a guilty conscience. The work of a madman. Vicious, petty, malign, brilliant. You had the feeling that he had spied on her through the keyhole, that he had caught her in an off moment, when she was picking her nose absent-mindedly, or scratching her ass. She sat there on the horsehair sofa, in a room without ventilation, an enormous room without a window. It might as well have been the anterior lobe of the pineal gland. Back of her ran the zigzag stairs leading to the balcony. They were covered with a bilious green carpet, such a green as could only emanate from a universe that had been pooped out. The most prominent thing was her buttocks, which were lopsided and full of scabs. She seemed to have slightly raised her ass from the sofa, as if to let a loud fart. Her face he had idealized. It looked sweet and virginal, pure as a cough drop. But her bosom was distended, swollen with sewer gas. She seemed to be swimming in a menstrual sea, an enlarged fetus with the dull, syrupy look of an angel. Nevertheless, one couldn't help but like him. He was an indefatigable worker, a man who hadn't a single thought in his head but paint. And cunning as a lynx withal. It was he who put it into my head to cultivate the friendship of Fillmore, a young man in the diplomatic service who had found his way into the little group that surrounded Kruger and Swift. Let him help you, he said. He doesn't know what to do with his money. When one spends what he has on himself, when one has a thoroughly good time with his own money, people are apt to say he doesn't know what to do with his money. For my part, I don't see any better use to which one can put money. About such individuals one can't say that they're generous or stingy. They put money into circulation, that's the principal thing. Fillmore knew that his days in France were limited. He was determined to enjoy them. And as one always enjoys himself better in the company of a friend, it was only natural that he should turn to one like myself, who had plenty of time on his hands, for that companionship which he needed. People said he was a bore, and so he was, I suppose, but when you're in need of your food you can put up with worse things than being bored. After all, despite the fact that he talked incessantly, and usually about himself or the authors whom he admired slavishly, such birds as Anatole France and Joseph Conrad, he nevertheless made my nights interesting in other ways. He liked to dance, he liked good wines, and he liked women. That he liked. Byron also, and Victor Hugo, one could forgive. He was only a few years out of college and he had plenty of time ahead of him to be cured of such tastes. What he had that I liked was a sense of adventure. We got even better acquainted, more intimate, I might say, due to a peculiar incident that occurred during my brief sojourn with Kruger. It happened just after the arrival of Collins, a sailor whom Fillmore had got to know on the way over from America. Anatole France, 1844–1924, French poet, journalist, and novelist. He won the 1921 Nobel Prize in Literature in recognition of his brilliant literary achievements, characterized as they are by a nobility of style, a profound human sympathy, grace, and a true Gallic temperament. Anatole France was also documented to have a brain volume just 2/3 the normal size. Joseph Conrad, 1857–1924, Polish-British writer. Regarded as one of the greatest novelists to write in the English language. He joined the British Merchant Marine in 1878, and was granted British nationality in 1886. Though he did not speak English fluently until his 20s, he was a master prose stylist who brought a non-English sensibility into English literature. His stories and novels, often with a nautical setting, depicted trials of the human spirit in the midst of an impassive, inscrutable universe. Many films have been adapted from, or inspired by, Conrad's works. George Gordon Byron, 1788–1824, British poet, politician, and a leading figure in the Romantic movement. Among his best-known works are the lengthy narrative poems Don Juan and Child, Harold's Pilgrimage, and the short lyric poem She Walks in Beauty. Victor Marie Hugo, 1802–1885, French poet, novelist, and dramatist of the Romantic movement. He is considered one of the greatest and best-known French writers outside France. His best-known works are the novels Les Miserables, 1862, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1831. The three of us used to meet regularly on the terrace of the Rotonde before going to dinner. It was always Pernod, a drink which put Collins in good humor and provided a base, as it were, for the wine and beer and fines, etc., which had to be guzzled afterwards. All during Collins's stay in Paris I lived like a duke, nothing but foul and good vintages, and desserts that I hadn't even heard of before. A month of this regimen and I should have been obliged to go to Baden or Vichy or Aix-les-Bains. Meanwhile Kruger was putting me up at his studio. I was getting to be a nuisance because I never showed up before 3 a.m. and it was difficult to rout me out of bed before noon. Overtly, Kruger never uttered a word of reproach, but his manner indicated plainly enough that I was becoming a bum. One day I was taken ill. The rich diet was taking effect upon me. I don't know what ailed me, but I couldn't get out of bed. I had lost all my stamina, and with it whatever courage I possessed. Kruger had to look after me, had to make broths for me, and so on. It was a trying period for him, more particularly because he was just on the verge of giving an important exhibition at his studio, a private showing to some wealthy connoisseurs, from whom he was expecting aid. The cot on which I lay was in the studio. There was no other room to put me in. The morning of the day he was to give his exhibition, Kruger awoke thoroughly disgruntled. If I had been able to stand on my feet, I know he would have given me a clout in the jaw and kicked me out. But I was prostrate, and weak as a cat. He tried to coax me out of bed, with the idea of locking me up in the kitchen upon the arrival of his visitors. I realized that I was making a mess of it for him. People can't look at pictures and statues with enthusiasm when a man is dying before their eyes. Kruger honestly thought I was dying. So did I. That's why, despite my feeling of guilt, I couldn't muster any enthusiasm when he proposed calling for the ambulance and having me shipped to the American hospital. I wanted to die there, comfortably, right in the studio. I didn't want to be urged to get up and find a better place to die in. I didn't care where I died. Really, so long as it wasn't necessary to get up. When he heard me talk this way, Kruger became alarmed. Worse than having a sick man in his studio should the visitors arrive, was to have a dead man. That would completely ruin his prospects, slim as they were. He didn't put it that way to me, of course, but I could see from his agitation that that was what worried him. And that made me stubborn. I refused to let him call the hospital. I refused to let him call a doctor. I refused everything. He got so angry with me finally that, despite my protestations, he began to dress me. I was too weak to resist. All I could do was to murmur weakly, "You bastard, you." Though it was warm outdoors, I was shivering like a dog. After he had completely dressed me, he flung an overcoat over me and slipped outside to telephone. "I won't go. I won't go," I kept saying, but he simply slammed the door on me. He came back in a few minutes and, without addressing a word to me, busied himself about the studio. Last minute preparations. In a little while there was a knock on the door. It was Fillmore. Collins was waiting downstairs, he informed me. He, two of them, Fillmore and Kruger, slipped their arms under me and hoisted me to my feet. As they dragged me to the elevator, Kruger softened up. "It's for your own good," he said. "And besides, it wouldn't be fair to me. You know what a struggle I've had all these years. You ought to think about me too." He was actually on the point of tears. Wretched and miserable as I felt, his words almost made me smile. He was considerably older than I, and even though he was a rotten painter, a rotten artist all the way through, he deserved a break at least once in a lifetime. "I don't hold it against you," I muttered. "I understand how it is. You know I always liked you," he responded. "When you get better you can come back here again, you can stay as long as you like." "Sure, I know. I'm not going to croak yet," I managed to get out. Somehow, when I saw Collins down below, my spirits revived. If ever any one seemed to be thoroughly alive, healthy, joyous, magnanimous, it was he. He picked me up as if I were a doll and laid me out on the seat of the cab gently too, which I appreciated after the way Kruger had manhandled me. When we drove up to the hotel that Collins was stopping at, there was a bit of a discussion with the proprietor, during which I lay stretched out on the sofa in the bureau. I could hear Collins saying to the patron that it was nothing, just a little breakdown, be all right in a few days. I saw him put a crisp bill in the man's hands and then, turning swiftly and lithely, he came back to where I was and said, "Come on. Buck up. Don't let him think you're croaking." And with that, he yanked me to my feet and, bracing me with one arm, escorted me to the elevator. "Don't let him think you're croaking." Obviously it was bad taste to die on people's hands. One should die in the bosom of his family, in private, as it were. His words were encouraging. I began to see it all as a bad joke. Upstairs, with the door closed, they undressed me and put me between the Sheets. You can't die now, God damn it, said Collins warmly. You'll put me in a hole. Besides, what the hell's the matter with you? Can't stand good living? Keep your chin up. You'll be eating a porterhouse steak in a day or two. You think you're ill? Wait, by Jesus, until you get a dose of syphilis. That's something to make you worry. And he began to relate, in a humorous way, his trip down the Yangtze, 178, with hair falling out and teeth rotting away. In the feeble state that I was in, the yam that he spun had an extraordinarily soothing effect upon me. It took me completely out of myself. He had guts, this guy. Perhaps he put it on a bit thick, for my benefit, but I wasn't listening to him critically at the moment. I was all ears and eyes. I saw the dirty yellow mouth of the river, the lights going up it. Hankow, the sea of yellow faces, the sampans shooting down through the gorges and the rapids flaming with the sulphurous breath of the dragon. What a story! The coolies swarming around the boat each day, dredging for the garbage that was flung overboard, Tom Slattery rising up on his deathbed to take a last look at the lights of Hankow, the beautiful Eurasian who lay in a dark room and filled his veins with poison, the monotony of blue jackets and yellow faces, millions and millions of them hollowed out by famine, ravaged by disease, subsisting on rats and dogs and roots, chewing the grass off the earth, devouring their own children. It was hard to imagine that this man's body had once been a mass of sores, that he had been shunned like a leper. His voice was so quiet and gentle, it was as though his spirit had been cleansed by all the suffering he had endured. As he reached for his drink, his face grew more and more soft, and his words actually seemed to caress me. And all the while China hanging over us like fate itself. A China rotting away, crumbling to dust like a huge dinosaur, yet preserving to the very end the glamour, the enchantment, the mystery, the cruelty of her hoary legends. I could no longer follow his story. My mind had slipped back to a 4th of July when I bought my first package of firecrackers, and with it the long pieces of punk which break so easily, the punk that you blow on to get a good red glow, the punk whose smell sticks to your fingers for days and makes you dream of strange things. The 4th of July, the streets are littered with bright red paper stamped with black and gold figures, and everywhere there are tiny firecrackers which have the most curious intestines, packages and packages of them, all strung together by their thin, flat, little gut strings, the color of human brains. All day long there is the smell of powder and punk, and the gold dust from the bright red wrappers sticks to your fingers. One never thinks of China, but it is there all the time on the tips of your fingers, and it makes your nose itchy, and long afterwards, when you have forgotten almost what a firecracker smells like, you wake up one day with gold leaf choking you, and the broken pieces of punk waft back their pungent odor, and the bright red wrappers give you a nostalgia for a people and a soil you have never known, but which is in your blood, mysteriously there in your blood, like the sense of time or space, a fugitive, constant value to which you turn more and more as you get old, which you try to seize with your mind, but ineffectually, because in everything Chinese there is wisdom and mystery and you can never grasp it with two hands or with your mind, but you must let it rub off, let it stick to your fingers, let it slowly infiltrate your veins. A few weeks later, upon receipt of a pressing invitation from Collins, who had returned to Le Havre, Fillmore and I boarded the train one morning, prepared to spend the weekend with him. It was the first time I had been outside of Paris since my arrival here. We were in fine fettle, drinking Anjou all the way to the coast. Collins had given us the address of a bar where we were to meet. It was a place called Jimmy's Bar, which everyone in Le Havre was supposed to know. We got into an open barouche at the station and started on a brisk trot for the rendezvous. There was still a half bottle of Anjou left, which we polished off as we rode along. Le Havre looked gay, sunny, the air was bracing, with that strong salty tang which almost made me homesick for New York. There were masts and hulls cropping up everywhere, bright bits of bunting, big open squares and high-ceilinged cafes such as one only sees in the provinces. A fine impression immediately. The city was welcoming us with open arms. Before we ever reached the bar we saw Collins coming down the street on a trot, heading for the station, no doubt, and a little late as usual. Fillmore immediately suggested a Pernod. We were all slapping each other on the back, laughing and spitting, drunk already from the sunshine and the salt sea air. Collins seemed undecided about the Pernod at first. He had a little dose of clap, he informed us. Nothing very serious, a strain most likely. He showed us a bottle he had in his pocket, Venetian it was called, if I remember rightly. The sailor's remedy for clap. We stopped off at a restaurant to have a little snack before repairing to Jimmy's place. It was a huge tavern with big, smoky rafters and tables creaking with food. We drank copiously of the wines that Collins recommended. Then we sat down on a terrace and had coffee and liqueurs. Collins was talking about the Baron de Charles, a man after his own heart, he said. For almost a year now he had been staying at Le Havre, going through the money that he had accumulated during his bootlegging days. His tastes were simple food, drink, women, and books. And a private bath. That he insisted on. We were still talking about the Baron de Charles when we arrived at Jimmy's Bar. It was late in the afternoon and the place was just beginning to fill up. Jimmy was there, his face red as a beet, and beside him was his spouse, a fine, buxom French woman with glittering eyes. We were given a marvelous reception all around. There were Pernods in front of us again. The gramophone was shrieking, people were jabbering away in English and French and Dutch and Norwegian and Spanish, and Jimmy and his wife, both of them looking very brisk and dapper, were slapping and kissing each other heartily and raising their glasses and clinking them all together, such a bubble and blabber of merriment that you felt like pulling off your clothes and doing a war dance. The women at the bar had gathered around like flies. If we were friends of Collins, that meant we were rich. It didn't matter that we had come in our old clothes, all anglais dressed like that. I hadn't a sou in my pocket, which didn't matter, of course, since I was the guest of honor. Nevertheless I felt somewhat embarrassed with two stunning looking horse hanging on my arms waiting for me to order something. I decided to take the bull by the horns. You couldn't tell any more which drinks were on the house and which were to be paid for. I had to be a gentleman, even if I didn't have a sou in my pocket. Yvette, that was Jimmy's wife, was extraordinarily gracious and friendly with us. She was preparing a little spread in our honor. It would take a little while yet. We were not to get too drunk. She wanted us to enjoy the meal. The gramophone was going like wild and Fillmore had begun to dance with a beautiful mulatto who had on a tight velvet dress that revealed all her charms. Collins slipped over to my side and whispered a few words about the girl at my side. The madam will invite her to dinner, he said, if you'd like to have her. She was an ex-whore who owned a beautiful home on the outskirts of the city. The mistress of a sea captain now. He was away and there was nothing to fear. If she likes you, she'll invite you to stay with her, he added. That was enough for me. I turned at once to Marcel and began to flatter the ass off her. We stood at the corner of the bar, pretending to dance, and mauled each other ferociously. Jimmy gave me a big horse wink and nodded his head approvingly. She was a lascivious bitch, this Marcel, and pleasant at the same time. She soon got rid of the other girl, I noticed, and then we settled down for a long and intimate conversation which was interrupted unfortunately by the announcement that dinner was ready. There were about 20 of us at the table, and Marcel and I were placed at one end opposite Jimmy and his wife. It began with the popping of champagne corks and was quickly followed by drunken speeches, during the course of which Marcel and I played with each other under the table. When it came my turn to stand up and deliver a few words, I had to hold the napkin in front of me. It was painful and exhilarating at the same time. I had to cut the speech very short because Marcel was tickling me in the crotch. All the while, the dinner lasted until almost midnight. I was looking forward to spending the night with Marcel in that beautiful home up on the cliff. But it was not to be. Collins had planned to show us about and I couldn't very well refuse. Don't worry about her, he said. You'll have a belly full of it before you leave. Tell her to wait here for you until we get back. She was a bit peeved at this, Marcel, but when we informed her that we had several days ahead of us, she brightened up. When we got outdoors, Fillmore very solemnly took us by the arm and said he had a little confession to make. He looked pale and worried. Well, what is it? Said Collins cheerfully. Spit it out. Fillmore couldn't spit it out like that, all at once. He hemmed and hawed. And finally he blurted out, well, when I went to the closet just a minute ago I noticed something. Then you've got it, said Collins triumphantly, and with that he flourishes the bottle of Venetian. Don't go to a doctor, he added venomously. They'll bleed you to death, the greedy bastards. And don't stop drinking either. That's all hooey. Take this twice a day, shake it well before using. And nothing's worse than worry, do you understand? Come on now. I'll give you a syringe and some permanganate when we get back. And so we started out into the night, down towards the waterfront where there was the sound of music and shouts and drunken oaths, Collins talking quietly all the while about this and that, about a boy he had fallen in love with, and the devil's time he had to get out of the scrape when the parents got wise to it. From that he switched back to the Baron de Charles and then To Kurtz, who had gone up the river and got lost. His favorite theme. I liked the way Collins moved against this background of literature continuously. It was like a millionaire who never stepped out of his Rolls-Royce. There was no intermediate realm for him between reality and ideas. When we entered the whorehouse on the Quai Voltaire, after he had flung himself on the divan and rung for girls and for drinks, he was still paddling up the river with Kurtz, and only when the girls had flopped on the bed beside him and stuffed his mouth with kisses did he cease his divagations. Then, as if he had suddenly realized where he was, he turned to the old mother who ran the place and gave her an eloquent spiel about his two friends who had come down from Paris expressly to see the joint. There were about half a dozen girls in the room, all naked and all beautiful to look at, I must say. They hopped about like birds while the three of us tried to maintain a conversation with the grandmother. Finally the latter excused herself and told us to make ourselves at home. I was altogether taken in by her, so sweet and amiable she was, so thoroughly gentle and maternal. And what manners! If she had been a little younger I would have made overtures to her. Certainly you would not have thought that we were in a den of vice, as it is called. Anyway, we stayed there an hour or so, and as I was the only one in condition to enjoy the privileges of the house, Collins and Fillmore remained downstairs chattering with the girls. When I returned I found the two of them stretched out on the bed. The girls had formed a semicircle about the bed and were singing with the most angelic voices the chorus of Roses in Picardy. We were sentimentally depressed when we left the house. Fillmore particularly. Collins swiftly steered us to a rough joint which was packed with drunken sailors on shore leave, and there we sat a while enjoying the homosexual rout that was in full swing. When we sallied out we had to pass through the red light district where there were more grandmothers with shawls about their necks, sitting on the doorsteps fanning themselves and nodding pleasantly to the passers-by. All such good-looking, kindly souls, as if they were keeping guard over a nursery. Little groups of sailors came swinging along and pushed their way noisily inside the gaudy joints. Sex everywhere, it was slopping over, a neap tide that swept the props from under the city. We piddled along at the edge of the basin where everything was jumbled and tangled. You had the impression that all these ships, these trawls and yachts and schooners and barges, had been blown ashore by a violent storm. In the space of 48 hours so many things had happened that it seemed as if we had been in Le Havre a month or more. We were planning to leave early Monday morning, as Fillmore had to be back on the job. We spent Sunday drinking and carousing, clap or no clap. That afternoon Collins confided to us that he was thinking of returning to his ranch in Idaho. He hadn't been home for 8 years and he wanted to have a look at the mountains again before making another voyage east. We were sitting in a whorehouse at the time, waiting for a girl to appear. He had promised to slip her some cocaine. He was fed up with Le Havre, he told us. Too many vultures hanging around his neck. Besides, Jimmy's wife had fallen in love with him and she was making things hot for him with her jealous fits. There was a scene almost every night. She had been on her good behavior since we arrived, but it wouldn't last, he promised us. She was particularly jealous of a Russian girl who came to the bar now and then when she got tight. A troublemaker. On top of it all, he was desperately in love with this boy whom he had told us about the first day. A boy can break your heart, he said. He's so damned beautiful. And so cruel. We had to laugh at this. It sounded preposterous. But Collins was in earnest. Around midnight Sunday, Fillmore and I retired. We had been given a room upstairs over the bar. It was sultry as the devil, not a breath of air stirring. Through the open windows we could hear them shouting downstairs and the gramophone going continually. All of a sudden, a storm broke, a regular cloudburst. And between the thunderclaps and the squalls that lashed the window panes, there came to our ears the sound of another storm raging downstairs at the bar. It sounded frightfully close and sinister. The women were shrieking at the tops of their lungs, bottles were crashing, tables were upset, and there was that familiar, nauseating thud that the human body makes when it crashes to the floor. About 6 o'clock Collins stuck his head in the door. His face was all plastered, and one arm was stuck in a sling. He had a big grin on his face. "Just as I told you," he said. "She broke loose last night. Suppose you heard the racket." We got dressed quickly and went downstairs to say goodbye to Jimmy. The place was completely demolished, not a bottle left standing, not a chair that wasn't broken. The mirror and the show window were smashed to bits. Jimmy was making himself an eggnog. On the way to the station we pieced the story together. The Russian girl had dropped in after we toddled off to bed, and Yvette had insulted her promptly, without even waiting for an excuse. They had commenced to pull each other's hair, and in the midst of it a big Swede had stepped in and given the Russian girl a sound slap in the jaw to bring her to her senses. That started the fireworks. Collins wanted to know what right this big stiff had to interfere in a private quarrel. He got a poke in the jaw for an answer, a good one that sent him flying to the other end of the bar. "Serves you right!" screamed Yvette, taking advantage of the occasion to swing a bottle at the Russian girl's head. And at that moment the thunderstorm broke loose. For a while there was a regular pandemonium, the women all hysterical and hungry to seize the opportunity to pay off private grudges. Nothing like a nice barroom brawl, so easy to stick a knife in a man's back or club him with a bottle when he's lying under a table. The poor Swede had found himself in a hornet's nest. Everyone in the place hated him, particularly his shipmates. They wanted to see him done in. And so they locked the door. And pushing the tables aside, they made a little space in front of the bar, where the two of them could have it out. And they had it out. They had to carry the poor devil to the hospital when it was over. Collins had come off rather lucky, nothing more than a sprained wrist and a couple of fingers out of joint, a bloody nose and a black eye. Just a few scratches, as he put it. But if he ever signed up with that Swede, he was going to murder him. It wasn't finished yet. He promised us that. And that wasn't the end of the fracas either. After that Yvette had to go out and get liquored up at another bar. She had been insulted and she was going to put an end to things. And so she hires a taxi and orders the driver to ride out to the edge of the cliff overlooking the water. She was going to kill herself, that's what she was going to do. But then she was so drunk that when she tumbled out of the cab she began to weep, and before anyone could stop her. She had begun to peel her clothes off. The driver brought her home that way, half naked, and when Jimmy saw the condition she was in, he was so furious with her that he took his razor strap and he belted the piss out of her, and she liked it, the bitch that she was. "Do it some more," she begged, down on her knees as she was and clutching him around the legs with her 2 arms. But Jimmy had enough of it. "You're a dirty old so," he said, and with his foot he gave her a shove in the guts that took the wind out of her and a bit of her sexy nonsense too. It was high time we were leaving. The city looked different in the early morning light. The last thing we talked about, as we stood there waiting for the train to pull out, was Idaho. The 3 of us were Americans. We came from different places, each of us, but we had something in common, a whole lot, I might say. We were getting sentimental, as Americans do when it comes time to part. We were getting quite foolish about the cows and sheep and the big open spaces where men are men and all that crap. If a boat had swung along instead of the train, we'd have hopped aboard and said goodbye to it all. But Collins was never to see America again, as I learned later, and Fillmore, well, Fillmore had to take his punishment too. In a way that none of us could have suspected then. It's best to keep America just like that, always in the background, a sort of picture postcard, which you look at in a weak moment. Like that, you imagine it's always there, waiting for you, unchanged, unspoiled, a big patriotic open space with cows and sheep and tender-hearted men ready to bugger everything in sight. Man, woman, or beast. It doesn't exist, America. It's a name you give to an abstract idea. Paris is like a whore. From a distance she seems ravishing, you can't wait until you have her in your arms. And 5 minutes later you feel empty, disgusted with yourself. You feel tricked. I returned to Paris with money in my pocket, a few hundred francs, which Collins had shoved in my pocket just as I was boarding the train. It was enough to pay for a room and at least a week's good rations. It was more than I had had in my hands at one time for several years. I felt elated, as though perhaps a new life was opening before me. I wanted to conserve it too, so I looked up a cheap hotel over a bakery on the Rue du Château, just off the Rue de Vanves, a place that Eugene had pointed out to me once. A few yards away was the bridge that spans the Montparnasse tracks. A familiar quarter. I could have had a room here for 100 francs a month. A room without any conveniences, to be sure, without even a window. And perhaps I would have taken it, just to be sure of a place to flop for a while, had it not been for the fact that in order to reach this room I would have been obliged to first pass through the room of a blind man. The thought of passing his bed every night had a most depressing effect upon me. I decided to look elsewhere. I went over to the Roussels, just behind the cemetery, and I looked at a sort of rat trap there with balconies, running around the courtyard. There were bird cages suspended from the balcony, too, all along the lower tier. A cheerful sight perhaps, but to me it seemed like the public ward in a hospital. The proprietor didn't seem to have all his wits either. I decided to wait for the night, to have a good look around, and then choose some attractive little joint in a quiet side street. At dinner time, I spent 15 francs for a meal, just about twice the amount I had planned to allot myself. That made me so wretched that I wouldn't allow myself to sit down for a coffee, even despite the fact that it had begun to drizzle. No. I would walk about a bit and then go quietly to bed, at a reasonable hour. I was already miserable, trying to husband my resources this way. I had never in my life done it, it wasn't in my nature. Finally it began to come down in buckets full. I was glad. That would give me the excuse I needed to duck somewhere and stretch my legs out. It was still too early to go to bed. I began to quicken my pace, heading back towards the Boulevard Raspail. Suddenly a woman comes up to me and stops me. Right in the pouring rain. She wants to know what time it is. I told her I didn't have a watch. And then she bursts out, just like this, "Oh, my good sir, do you speak English by chance?" I nod my head. It's coming down in torrents. Now, perhaps, my dear good man, you would be so kind as to take me to a cafe. It is raining so and I haven't the money to sit down anywhere. You will excuse me, my dear sir, but you have such a kind face. I knew you were English right away. And with this she smiles at me, a strange, half-demented smile. Perhaps you could give me a little advice, dear sir. I am all alone in the world, my God, it is terrible to have no money. This dear sir and kind sir and my good man, etc., had me on the verge of hysteria. I felt sorry for her and yet I had to laugh. I did laugh. I laughed. Right in her face. And then she laughed too, a weird, high-pitched laugh, off key, an altogether unexpected piece of cachinnation. 182 I caught her by the arm and we made a bolt for it to the nearest cafe. She was still giggling when we entered the bistro. My dear good sir, she began again, perhaps you think I am not telling you the truth. I am a good girl. I come of a good family. Only, and here she gave me that wan, broken smile again, only I am so misfortunate as not to have a place to sit down. At this I began to laugh again. I couldn't help it, the phrases she used, the strange accent, the crazy hat she had on, that demented smile. Listen, I interrupted, what nationality are you? I'm English, she replied. That is, I was born in Poland, but my father is Irish. So that makes you English? Yes, she said, and she began to giggle again, sheepishly and with a pretense of being coy. I suppose you know a nice little hotel where you could take me? I said. This, not because I had any intention of going with her, but just to spare her the usual preliminaries. Oh, my dear sir, she said, as though I had made the most grievous error. I'm sure you don't mean that. I'm not that kind of a girl. You were joking with me, I see that. You're so good, you have such a kind face. I would not dare to speak to a Frenchman as I did to you. They insult you right away. She went on in this vein for some time. I wanted to break away from her. But she didn't want to be left alone. She was afraid her papers were not in order. Wouldn't I be good enough to walk her to her hotel? Perhaps I could lend her 15 or 20 francs, to quiet the patron? I walked her to the hotel where she said she was stopping and I put a 50 francs bill in her hand. Either she was very clever, or very innocent, it's hard to tell. Sometimes, but, at any rate, she wanted me to wait until she ran to the bistro for change. I told her not to bother. And with that she seized my hand impulsively and raised it to her lips. I was flabbergasted. I felt like giving her every damned thing I had. That touched me, that crazy little gesture. I thought to myself, it's good to be rich once in a while, just to get a new thrill like that. Just the same, I didn't lose my head. 50 francs. That was quite enough to squander on a rainy night. As I walked off she waved to me with that crazy little bonnet which she didn't know how to wear. It was as though we were old playmates. I felt foolish and giddy. My dear, kind sir, you have such a gentle face, you are so good, etc. I felt like a saint. When you feel all puffed up inside, it isn't so easy to go to bed right away. You feel as though you ought to atone for such unexpected bursts of goodness. Passing the jungle, I caught a glimpse of the dance floor, women with bare backs and ropes of pearls choking them, or so it looked, were wiggling their beautiful bottoms at me. Walked right up to the bar and ordered a coupe of champagne. When the music stopped, a beautiful blonde, she looked like a Norwegian, took a seat right beside me. The place wasn't as crowded or as gay as it had appeared from outside. There were only a half-dozen couples in the place. They must have all been dancing at once. I ordered another coupe of champagne in order not to let my courage dribble away. When I got up to dance with the blonde, there was no one on the floor but us. Any other time I would have been self-conscious, but the champagne and the way she clung to me, the dimmed lights and the solid feeling of security which the few hundred francs gave me, well, we had another dance together, a sort of private exhibition, and then we fell into conversation. She had begun to weep, that was how it started. I thought possibly she had had too much to drink. So I pretended not to be concerned. And meanwhile I was looking around to see if there was any other timber available. But the place was thoroughly deserted. The thing to do when you're trapped is to breeze at once. If you don't, you're lost. What retained me, oddly enough, was the thought of paying for a hat check a second time. One always lets himself in for it because of a trifle. The reason she was weeping, I discovered soon enough, was because she had just buried her child. She wasn't Norwegian either, but French, and a midwife to boot. A chic midwife, I must say, even with the tears running down her face. I asked her if a little drink would help to console her, whereupon she very promptly ordered a whiskey and tossed it off in the wink of an eye. Would you like another? I suggested gently. She thought she would, she felt so rotten, so terribly dejected. She thought she would like a package of Camels too. No. Wait a minute, she said, I think I'd rather have Les Pall Mall. Have what you like, I thought, but stop weeping, for Christ's sake, it gives me the willies. I jerked her to her feet for another dance. On her feet she seemed to be another person. Maybe grief makes one more lecherous, I don't know. I murmured something about breaking away. Where to? She said eagerly. Oh, anywhere. Some quiet place where we can talk. I went to the toilet and counted the money over again. I hid the 100-franc notes in my fob pocket 183 and kept a 50-franc note and the loose Change in my trousers pocket. I went back to the bar determined to talk. Turkey. She made it easier for me because she herself introduced the subject. She was in difficulties. It was not only that she had just lost her child, but her mother was home, ill, very ill, and there was the doctor to pay and medicine to be bought, and so on and so forth. I didn't believe a word of it, of course. And since I had to find a hotel for myself, I suggested that she come along with me and stay the night. A little economy there, I thought to myself. But she wouldn't do that. She insisted on going home, said she had an apartment to herself and besides she had to look after her mother. On reflection I decided that it would be still cheaper sleeping at her place, so I said yes and let's go immediately. Before going, however, I decided it was best to let her know just how I stood, so that there wouldn't be any squawking at the last minute. I thought she was going to faint when I told her how much I had in my pocket. The likes of it, she said. Highly insulted. She was. I thought there would be a scene. Undaunted, however, I stood my ground. Very well, then, I'll leave you, I said quietly. Perhaps I've made a mistake. I should say you have, she exclaimed, but clutching me by the sleeve at the same time. Écoute, chérie, sois raisonnable. When I heard that all my confidence was restored, I knew that it would be merely a question of promising her a little extra and everything would be okay. All right, I said. Wearily, I'll be nice to you, you'll see. You were lying to me, then, she said. Yes, I smiled, I was just lying. Before I had even put my hat on she had hailed a cab. I heard her give the Boulevard de Clichy for an address. That was more than the price of a room. I thought to myself. Oh well, there was time yet, we'd see. I don't know how it started anymore but soon she was raving to me about Henry Bordeaux. I have yet to meet a whore who doesn't know of Henry Bordeaux. But this one was genuinely inspired, her language was beautiful. Now, so tender, so discerning, that I was debating how much to give her. It seemed to me that I had heard her say quant ilny aura plus de temps. It sounded like that, anyway. In the state I was in, a phrase like that was worth 100 francs. I wondered if it was her own or if she had pulled it from Henry Bordeaux. Little matter. It was just the right phrase with which to roll up to the foot of Montmartre. Good evening, Mother, I was saying to myself. Daughter, and I will look after you. Quant ilny aura plus de temps. She was going to show me her diploma, too, I remembered that. She was all a flutter, once the door had closed behind us. Distracted. Wringing her hands and striking Sarah Bernhardt poses, half undressed too, and pausing between times to urge me to hurry, to get undressed, to do this and do that. Finally, when she had stripped down and was poking about with a chemise in her hand, searching for her kimono, I caught hold of her and gave her a good squeeze. She had a look of anguish on her face when I released her. My God! My God! I must go downstairs and have a look at Mother! She exclaimed. You can take a bath if you like, chérie. There I'll be back in a few minutes. At the door I embraced her again. I was in my underclothes and I had a tremendous erection. Somehow all this anguish and excitement, all the grief and histrionics, only whetted my appetite. Perhaps she was just going downstairs to quiet her maquereau. I had a feeling that something unusual was happening, some sort of drama which I would read about in the morning paper. I gave the place a quick inspection. There were 2 rooms and a bath, not badly furnished. Rather coquettish. There was her diploma on the wall, first class, as they all read. And there was the photograph of a child, a little girl with beautiful locks, on the dresser. I put the water on for a bath, and then I changed my mind. If something were to happen and I were found in the tub, I didn't like the idea. I paced back and forth, getting more and more uneasy as the minutes rolled by. When she returned she was even more upset than before. She's going to die, she's going to die. She kept wailing. For a moment I was almost on the point of leaving. How the hell can you climb over a woman when her mother's dying downstairs, perhaps right beneath you? I put my arms around her, half in sympathy and half determined to get what I had come for. As we stood thus she murmured, as if in real distress, her need for the money I had promised her. It was for ma man. Shit, I didn't have the heart to haggle about a few francs at that moment. I walked over to the chair where my clothes were lying and I wiggled a 100-franc note out of my fob pocket, carefully keeping my back turned to her just the same. And, as a further precaution, I placed my pants on the side of the bed where I knew I was going to flop. The 100 francs wasn't altogether satisfactory to her. But I could see from the feeble way that she protested that it was quite enough. Then, with an energy that astonished me, she flung off her kimono and jumped into bed. As soon as I had put my arms around her and pulled her to me, she reached for the switch and out went the lights. She embraced me passionately, and she groaned as all French cunts do when they get you in bed. She was getting me frightfully roused with her carrying on. That business of turning out the lights was a new one to me, it seemed like the real thing. But I was suspicious too, and as soon as I could manage conveniently I put my hand out to feel if my trousers were still there on the chair. I thought we were settled for the night. The bed felt very comfortable. Softer than the average hotel bed, and the sheets were clean. I had noticed that. If only she wouldn't squirm so. You would think she hadn't slept with a man for a month. I wanted to stretch it out. I wanted full value for my 100 francs. But she was mumbling all sorts of things in that crazy bed. Language which goes to your blood even more rapidly when it's in the dark. I was putting up a stiff fight, but it was impossible with her groaning and gasping going on, and her muttering, "Vite chérie. Vite chérie. Oh, c'est bon. Oh, oh. Vite, vite, chérie." I tried to count, but it was like a fire alarm going off. Vile, chérie. And this time she gave such a gasping shudder that bango. I heard the stars chiming, and there was my 100 francs gone and the 50 that I had forgotten all about, and the lights were on again, and with the same alacrity that she had bounced into bed she was bouncing out again. And grunting and squealing like an old sow. I lay back and puffed a cigarette, gazing ruefully at my pants the while. They were terribly wrinkled. In a Moment she was back again, wrapping the kimono around her, and telling me in that agitated way which was getting on my nerves that I should make myself at home. I'm going downstairs to see mother, she said. Mais fates. Comme chez vous, chérie. Je reviens tout de suite. After a quarter of an hour had passed, I began to feel thoroughly restless. I went inside and I read through a letter that was lying on the table. It was nothing on any account a love letter. In the bathroom I examined all the bottles on the shelf. She had everything a woman requires to make herself smell beautiful. I was still hoping that she would come back and give me another 50 francs worth. But time dragged on and there was no sign of her. I began to grow alarmed. Perhaps there was someone dying downstairs. Absent-mindedly, out of a sense of self-preservation, I suppose, I began to put my things on. As I was buckling my belt, it came to me like a flash how she had stuffed the 100-franc note into her purse. In the excitement of the moment she had thrust the purse in the wardrobe, on the upper shelf. I remembered the gesture she made standing on her tip toes and reaching for the shelf. It didn't take me a minute to open the wardrobe and feel around for the purse. It was still there. I opened it hurriedly and saw my 100-franc note lying snugly between the silk coverlets. I put the purse back just as it was, slipped into my coat and shoes. And then I went to the landing and listened intently. I couldn't hear a sound. Where she had gone to, Christ only knows. In a jiffy I was back at the wardrobe and fumbling with her purse. I pocketed the 100 francs and all the loose change besides. Then, closing the door silently, I tiptoed down the stairs, and when once I had hit the street I walked just as fast as my legs would carry me. At the Café Boudin I stopped for a bite. The whores there, having a gay time pelting a fat man who had fallen asleep over his meal. He was sound asleep, snoring, in fact, and yet his jaws were working away mechanically. The place was in an uproar. There were shouts of all aboard. And then a concerted banging of knives and forks. He opened his eyes for a moment, blinked stupidly, and then his head rolled forward again on his chest. I put the 100-franc bill carefully away in my fob pocket and counted the change. The din around me was increasing and I had difficulty to recall exactly whether I had seen first class on her diploma or not. It bothered me. About her mother I didn't give a damn. I hoped she had croaked by now. It would be strange if what she had said were true. Too good to believe. Vite chérie, vite. Vite. And that other half-wit with her, my good sir, and you have such a kind face. I wondered if she had really taken a room in that hotel we stopped by. It was along toward the close of summer when Fillmore invited me to come and live with him. He had a studio apartment overlooking the cavalry barracks just off the Place Duplex. We had seen a lot of each other ever since the little trip to Le Havre. If it hadn't been for Fillmore I don't know where I should be today, dead, most likely. I would have asked you long before, he said, if it hadn't been for that little bitch Jackie. I didn't know how to get her off my hands. I had to smile. It was always like that with Fillmore. He had a genius for attracting homeless bitches. Anyway, Jackie had finally cleared out of her own accord. The rainy season was coming on, the long, dreary stretch of Grease and fog and squirts of rain that make you damp and miserable. An execrable place in the winter, Paris. A climate that eats into your soul, that leaves you bare as the Labrador coast. I noticed with some anxiety that the only means of heating the place was the little stove in the studio. However, it was still comfortable. And the view from the studio window was superb. In the morning Fillmore would shake me roughly and leave a 10-franc note on the pillow. As soon as he had gone I would settle back for a final snooze. Sometimes I would lie abed till noon. There was nothing pressing, except to finish the book, and that didn't worry me much because I was already convinced that nobody would accept it anyway. Nevertheless, Fillmore was much impressed by it. When he arrived in the evening with a bottle under his arm, the first thing he did was to go to the table and see how many pages I had knocked off. At first I enjoyed the show of enthusiasm, but later, when I was running dry, it made me devilishly uneasy to see him poking around, searching for the pages that were supposed to trickle out of me like water from a tap. When there was nothing to show, I felt exactly like some bitch whom he had harbored. He used to say about Jackie, I remembered it. Would have been all right if only she had slipped me a piece of ass once in a while. If I had been a woman I would have been only too glad to slip him a piece of ass. It would have been much easier than to feed him the pages which he expected. Nevertheless, he tried to make me feel at ease. There was always plenty of food and wine, and now and then he would insist that I accompany him to a dancing. He was fond of going to a nigger joint on the Rue d'Odessa where there was a good-looking mulatto who used to come home with us occasionally. The one thing that bothered him was that he couldn't find a French girl who liked to drink. They were all too sober to satisfy him. He liked to bring a woman back to the studio and guzzle it with her before getting down to business. He also liked to have her think that he was an artist. As the man from whom he had rented the place was a painter, it was not difficult to create an impression. The canvases which we had found in the armoire were soon stuck about the place, and one of the unfinished ones conspicuously mounted on the easel. Unfortunately, they were all of a surrealistic quality, and the impression they created was usually unfavorable. Between a whore, a concierge, and a cabinet minister there is not much difference in taste where pictures are concerned. It was a matter of great relief to Fillmore when Mark Swift began to visit us regularly with the intention of doing my portrait. Fillmore had a great admiration for Swift. He was a genius, he said. And though there was something ferocious about everything he tackled, nevertheless when he painted a man or an object you could recognize it for what it was. At Swift's request I had begun to grow a beard. The shape of my skull, he said, required a beard. I had to sit by the window with the Eiffel Tower in back of me because he wanted the Eiffel Tower in the picture too. He also wanted the typewriter in the picture. Kruger got the habit of dropping in too about this time. He maintained that Swift knew nothing about painting. It exasperated him to see things out of proportion. He believed in nature's laws, implicitly. Swift didn't give a fuck about nature, he wanted to paint what was inside his head. Anyway, there was Swift's portrait of me stuck on the easel now, and though everything was out of proportion, even a cabinet minister could see that it was a human head, a man with a beard. The concierge, indeed, began to take a great interest in the picture, she thought. The likeness was striking. and she liked the idea of showing the Eiffel Tower. In the background, things rolled along this way peacefully for about a month or more. The neighborhood appealed to me, particularly at night when the full squalor and lugubriousness of it made itself felt.